She now is an art critic, art activist, artist, and designer. She has exhibited internationally. She has taught at universities in the USA, Mexico, Singapore, and studied in Holland. She recently published her book, Transnational Play, Piracy, Urban Art, and Mobile Games. All yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Piero. And such interesting talks. I'm happy to be here and be thinking about something else in these ashy post-apocalyptic times that we're in California. I'm putting on my other hat for a second. Ilka, would like to talk to you later on after the talk about my game company, Green Science Games. I think we have a lot to talk about. So, anyway.
Absolutely, yeah, love to. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen.
Okay.
So tonight I thought I would take the opportunity to talk about my second book, Transnational Play. It's been in the works for a couple years, and it's just been published by the series Games and Play at Amsterdam University Press. And the initial inspiration for the book came from the time that I was exhibiting a lot internationally, and also lived in Latin America, in Mexico, and I encountered a vibrant community of public artists working with games or working playfully in different ways. And those artists include Rene Canales Hayashi, whose image on the top left of a play sculpture that he built on the outskirts of Buenos Aires for kids is an example of his public art that he's made such works around the world. On the bottom left is Giselle Voigelman, who is a Brazilian. Rene's from Mexico. Giselle is from Brazil, and she's an artist who's been working for quite a while, and also a professor of urbanism. And she just published a book on the reconfiguration of the city in the wake of COVID as well. But this is in this chapter, I focus on her artwork, where she talks about mobile devices and art in the city. This is going back to 2002, that work, Poetrica. And then on the top right is the work of Carolina Caicedo, some early work that she did in collaboration with a group called Cambalache Collective, the Museum of the Street, where in Bogota, in Colombia, where they went around with this playful toy-like cart and did exchanges with people on the street of artworks. And then on the bottom right is a work, a seminal work for game art by Angel Constantini from Mexico City, who's a curator and educator and net artist and game artist. And his work Atari Noise, where he recycled a Atari console and made this experience that at the time, this is in the late 90s, this was understood in early 2000s, his work was understood as glitch art. And nowadays, I think that we could look at it under a different lens as well. In interviews that I came across with him, he talks about local influences. The idea of recycling is important for him. And he was inspired by the electronics recycled, I'm losing the word here, but and recycled electronics that he was working with as material, as source material in Mexico City that came from from other parts of from the States. So that was the initial inspiration for the book, and I talk about an aesthetics of recycling that's apparent in much of this work, and attention to the environment and to social public concerns. And then later on, I was inspired by over a decade that I lived in Singapore and traveled around Southeast Asia and encountered many game developers and players making independent mobile games. And so the latter portion of the book gets into that. These are some of the underlying questions in the book. Who plays games in a transnational context? Who develops the games the world plays? How do people get access to games across digital divides? And what are some of the novel strategies and approaches that players and developers outside the first world, the global north, have come up with for playing games? And the image on the right is a work by Rene Canales Hayashi from Nicaragua that he made in collaboration with some other artists, of these kind of Lego-like boats that add up into a larger shape that you can play with. Further questions that I explore in the book are, should game piracy be reframed as a public service of what the Dutch media scholar Joost Rossens calls ludoliteracy, or he and some other theoreticians have come up with that term for the idea of gaining literacy to the idioms of gameplay. Can we understand piracy as a public service that teaches people, that keeps the world up to date, the rest of the world that can't afford games otherwise, if they come from poor countries with playing games? Then also I look into what are some of the more legal localization strategies around the globe for playing games that are being implemented in places like Vietnam and Brazil. I also talk about play privilege. Obviously, I'm a white woman, and I have a privileged educational background in the United States and from Europe. So I need to also reflect on my own position when I speak about the concerns of others. I talk about speaking agency and my method, which includes lots of interviews with artists and game developers and players. So, and how can an intersectional perspective on gender, culture, nationality, and socioeconomic status provide further insight? Is a question related to that. What environmental and ecological approaches to play can the world learn from the global south, from countries outside the first world? And the last question that I get into is, what does a post-colonial critique of game cartography reveal? Post-colonial critique of game cartography or map making. So I'm going to close off with just a bit of reading from a chapter entitled The Geopolitics of Pokemon Go. This chapter, I started it when I lived in Singapore and Pokemon Go came out, and I was interested in exploring what happens when you cross the border from an affluent nation like Singapore into a relatively less affluent nation like Malaysia, where you have a different kind of set of experiences and perils that you encounter. And then I moved back in the process of writing this chapter, I moved back to the States, and I continued doing research, ethnographic research for it at the border between the United States and Mexico. And I was in contact with the Tijuana Pokemon Go Facebook group, and a a player from there gave me a tour, a high-level player kindly and generously gave me a tour of her city and the best spots to play Pokemon Go. So I'll read a little bit from this chapter. The chapter starts out more theoretically. It looks into the power of map making, and it is inspired by theorists like Sybil Lamb, who's talked a lot about location-based map games in her writing in a very careful and insightful way, and also by Suvik Mukherjee, who's applied post-colonial analysis to territorial approaches to within games, and it then gets into more of on-the-ground field work. So I'll start out from the more theoretical section, and then I'll read just a bit from the other part. Although there is much that is new about coded, automated, data-driven mobile location-based games, older cartographic practices are also at work in a game like Pokemon Go. Practices such as touring, navigation, territory marking, and empire building. The aim of this section is to start to address the question, answered in a somewhat preliminary way in Lamb's analysis with mutable game maps that dynamically visualize player movement, of who exercises the power of cartography, of map making in these ludic play territories. In this section, I will make the case that a 21st century augmented reality soft empire is being built. Not a military empire, but a networked digital empire linking together nodes on the map. Instead of European conquistadors, naval explorers, and colonialists, the conquering map makers are now northern global communications corporations like Google, entrepreneur-friendly open source data companies like OpenStreetMap, and augmented reality game developers like Niantic. I then go on to explore some of these issues, and I'm also very much inspired by a military theorist from a couple hundred years ago, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who writes about geopolitics and the way that you can control a larger area with smaller key nodes like seaports, and how you could apply this kind of analysis to the playstations within a game like Pokemon Go. So these points or stations, when chained together, add up to a larger system of control. Mahan writes, in the most active days of colonizing arose the demand for stations along the road, like the Cape of Good Hope, St. Helena, and Mauritius, not primarily for trade, but for defense and war. The demand for the possession of posts like Gibraltar, Malta, Louisburg, at the entrance of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Posts whose value was chiefly strategic, though not necessarily wholly so. So these posts could fluctuate between having a wartime value in wartime to a more commercial value. So from there, I go into more on the ground recounting of my fieldwork, and I'll just close with reading one paragraph from there, a game mapping tour of bordering cities. After a more abstract discussion of the power of cartography, the geopolitics of augmented reality games, and imagining serpentine mestiza play, I will now narrate a more direct experience of playing territories, moving from a more theoretical eagle's eye of the map to the snake's perspective from the ground. I began writing this chapter while living in Singapore as a foreign game design university instructor for almost a decade, with the intention of conducting a virtual tour of Singapore and its neighboring border city across the Strait of Johor Bahru in Malaysia. The initial focus of this journey was to document the experience of navigating the augmented features of these two cities' play terrains. My initial interest was in how cartographical experiences of the same game differ when crossing the border from north to south, across the border from a wealthy city to one in a relatively less affluent, less safe, and less privileged nation. My methodological approach to this tour drew from digital ethnography and game ethnography, research approaches that rely, in addition to observation and analysis, on interactive participation and interviews with insider game player informants who have dedicated what often amount to months and even years to a game. My privileged identity as a Northerner, as an outsider, a tourist, a university researcher, a white expatriate in a British post-colonial territory in Southeast Asia, and then as a white middle-class American, a gringa in a Spanish-speaking Mexican city, also should be acknowledged. Intersectionally, my gender, my age, in addition to my race and my nationality, and even my personal history and my connection to the border, become part of retelling the navigation of border cities via an augmented reality game.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Roger.
You got me thinking about the history of games. You know, chess was invented in India, I think. How do we need to understand the nature of games in other cultures?
Well, there's a lot that we can learn from other cultures. We in terms of, we can take inspiration from them in our game design as game designers and developers. That's what one of the last chapters in the book is about, a tour through Southeast Asia. And I talk about mobile games like Unblock Me that are inspired by an ancient Northern Thai game from Chiang Mai of wooden blocks moving together, and it's one of the most popular mobile games. Most people don't know it comes from Thailand.
Thank you. I just bought your book on Amazon.
But yeah, and that chapter I'm looking at different approaches that developers have taken, where some people think, oh, we need to model ourselves on the Silicon Valley or California approach to game development, and others have looked for more local sources for inspiration for developing their games. Indonesia has all kinds of interesting, more locally influenced games.
AnneMarie, can you see the Q&A? You have 2 more questions. Q&A, not chat. Go to the bottom of the screen. You should see.
Okay, yeah.
Q&A. You see Catherine's question? Can you describe an example? Yeah.
Okay. Can you describe an example of transnational gaming? Where does gender and race arise or go or disappear in these digital games? So games are not always, designed or developed in the country where they're played. A lot of casual games are developed in the global north and played in the global south. So, for instance, in a chapter, we look at the rise of female players of mobile games in Brazil. And there's one game I look at, Mini Fazenda, that is kind of like a Brazilian localized version of Farmville. And at first, when I looked at this game, I thought, oh, this must have been made by Brazilians. And then I, looked a little bit further, and I realized that it was developed by a group of entrepreneurs who had Harvard MBAs, who also Farmville was developed by a developer with a Harvard MBA. And so there are a set of developers in the States who are looking outward globally in terms of profit and localizing games across borders. So that's one example of games that are moving across borders, and that's what I mean by transnational. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a game that's empowering, and I explore some of those issues in that chapter. If women are playing games more, but they're addictive games, what does that mean? Is that comparable to the global soap opera industry, where you have more women watching a certain medium of television, is that empowering or is that disempowering? I look into some of those questions. Casual games can be very addictive. But at the same time, I don't want to say, oh, just because more women are starting to play these games and more people around the world are starting to play them, that now we have to say, oh, there's such terrible vices. And before, when it was mostly white young men playing games, then we didn't have that kind of pathological approach to them. So I like to explore these kinds of questions in the book. Okay, I see some more questions here. How should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
How can we make cultural relevant games, like games for certain countries based on their stories? That's a good question, and that's kind of like what I was talking about with the chapter that's a tour of Southeast Asia, where I contrast different approaches. Mostly in Thailand, they have the idea that they're going to do outsourcing of games, and so they don't make that many games that have a really kind of Thai stamp on them. But then you go to a country like Indonesia, which is poorer than Thailand, but they have all these culturally inspired games inspired by the very rich culture. Not that I'm saying like Indonesian culture is more rich than Thai culture, but maybe there's more awareness of the relevance of their culture and the idea that you could put that into a game. Are there any tips on making educational games that are fun? Most seem to lack the fun factor. I would like to make games for STEM education. Ooh, that's a good question. That's our company, Green Science Games, and Alter Learning it's our two startup companies that I'm a co-founder in, grappling with those questions. Really like make more engaging educational game content. In Singapore, I taught an educational serious games class, and thought a lot about what it is, games like Minecraft EDU that are more immersive, and what makes those a game like that more engaging. As opposed to a lot of educational games, I think they make the mistake of thinking that they need to separate pedagogy from gameplay, and what makes the game more it's like play a fun game and then have some kind of information at the end that you get, and then play the fun game again. I don't think that usually works that well. I mean, we can talk more about that for a while, but let me see, there's one last question.
Okay, on this note, thank you for joining us for this webinar. Thank you, Roger, AnneMarie, and Ilke. Thank you, Tammy, for hosting us at USF. The next of these online lasers from my side, it will be on September 17 at 6 p.m. We'll have an AI scientist live from China. So it will be September 18 at 9 a.m. in Beijing, talking about the brain-inspired artificial intelligence and ethics of artificial intelligence. Okay, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, everybody. See you around.
Thanks, everybody, for presenting.
Thank you, Tammy. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.